Tonight, our e-forum is the final in at least this iteration of the forum in response to the pandemic, theological resources in response to the pandemic. And it's really been just a tremendous experience to gather with many of you week after week and to hear the insights of Eden Theological Seminary professors from their different fields and areas of study, as well as colleagues in ministry and leaders in the progressive Christian movement, joining us to really delve into the resources of the faith and what they have to offer us during this time of pandemic. And so we've been very grateful for this space and for this time with you all. So we're planning on taking a hiatus for a few weeks, and we'll be back with some new programming, some new leaders, and some new directions. So we hope you stay tuned, and we'll be back for us in the weeks to come. Tonight, we are joined by Eden's Assistant Professor of Church History and Historical Theology, Reverend Dr. Adam Ployd.
It's Reverend Doctor.
It is Reverend Doctor.
It is.
Okay. He is a deacon in the United Methodist Church, and he is also a member of the Eden faculty, teaching in the area of church history, the author of Augustine, the Trinity, and the Church, and soon to be the author of a new book he is working on Augustine, martyrdom, and classical rhetoric. So we are delighted with Dr. Ployd's scholarship in teaching at Eden, and we are really excited for his work tonight, where he's going to delve into the Desert Mother and Father spiritual tradition and the resources it has to offer us about isolation and spirituality during this pandemic as we experience isolation. And so this is really going to be a treat. I know this summer, Dr. Ployd will be offering a course around this same topic. And so if this is of interest to you, you may want to wander over to the Eden website and check out that offering for the master's level courses this summer. As we begin tonight, I'm going to read a psalm. I have it on pretty good authority that the Desert Mothers and Fathers turn to the Psalms often, and so this is a nice intersection with Professor McCann's offering a few weeks ago on the theology of the Psalms for engaging in this time of pandemic. And this is one of my favorite Psalms, and I found myself reading it this week in a new way and hearing some of its rhetoric in a new way. And so I, in light of the pandemic, so I'm going to share this psalm and say a few words about how we'll proceed in the forum afterwards, and we'll hand it off to Dr. Ployd. So here we are, Psalm 42. Listen for the word of the Lord speaking to you. As a deer longs for flowing streams, so my soul longs for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and behold the face of God? My tears have been my food day and night, while people say to me continually, where is your God? These things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I went with the throng and led them in procession to the house of the Lord with glad shouts and songs of thanksgiving, a multitude keeping festival. Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise God, my help and my God. My soul is cast down within me. Therefore, I remember you from the land of Jordan and of Hermon and of Mount Mizar. Deep calls to deep at the thunder of your cataracts. All your waves and your billows have gone over me. By day, the Lord commands the Lord's steadfast love. And at night, God's song is with me, a prayer to the God of my life. I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why must I walk about mournfully because the enemy oppresses me? As with a deadly wound in my body, my adversaries taunt me, while they say to me continually, where is your God? Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise God, my help and my God. Amen.
Amen.
So the way the forum is designed is that Professor Ployd will offer his presentation, and while he is doing that, we encourage you to engage in comments and questions in the chat, and I will be scurrying about in there, gleaning those questions and comments, and will engage Dr. Ployd with your thoughts and questions when he concludes. So we'll have a little bit of time of interaction at the end. So without any further ado, Adam, thank you.
Thank you, President-elect Krause. I greatly appreciate that introduction and the psalm to get us started. And to everyone who has gathered, welcome. It is great to be with you this evening in the time where we only have virtual gathering. It feels that virtual gathering has become life-giving in a way it never seemed to me to be in the past. So thank you for being a part of this. There comes a point in my classes, normally about, let's say 4 weeks in, where students have gotten tired of hearing about the Trinity, of hearing about Christology, of hearing about natures and hypostases and all of those things that go into the more, or at least the seemingly abstract nature of theology. And around that time, one student representing the disquiet of the crowd will raise their hand and say in desperation, why does this matter? Aren't we just supposed to love God and love neighbor? It's that simple. My response over the last year has always been the same. If it is true, and I think it is, that our job is to love God and love neighbor, why don't we? What prevents us from doing so? And for my money, that question is what lies at that lies at the heart of a lot of theological investigation. I think even questions like the nature of God and the triune identity, the nature of Christ and human and divine, and all of these nuanced theological discussions ultimately go back to, why don't we love God and neighbor? And how do we change that? Or how does God change that, rather? So the figures we're going to be talking about tonight face that question head on. They represent one way in which early Christians tried to answer that question, and with God's help, um, to try to fix it as best we can. So the figures we're talking about tonight, the so-called desert mothers and fathers, represent a group of Christians that individually or in small groups made their way out to the wildernesses of Egypt, Palestine, Syria, modern-day Turkey, and pursued a life of isolation, separated from the ordinary life of the city or of the town, because they believed, ironically, that the only way they could come to love God and neighbor was to get a little bit of distance between their neighbor. And don't tell my wife this, or my beautiful son this, but if you've been cooped up and quarantined with someone who you love deeply, you might feel like you need a little bit of space to really love them better. But with that in mind, I would like to go to a quick slide. Make sure I'm getting the right one. There it is. Pay no attention to the demons on the right. We'll get there in a second. So, on the left, you have a map of ancient Egypt or late antique Egypt during the time of the Desert Fathers and Mothers, and we're talking mainly the 4th and 5th centuries, so the early 300s through the 400s. Now, of course, people doing this persisted throughout the centuries, but there's a particular set of generations of monks, and I mean female and male monks, who are remembered as the fathers and mothers of this tradition. And they were primarily, though not exclusively, located within the Egyptian wilderness. I'd like to highlight just a few things on this map. One is at the top left of the map, you see the city of Alexandria. Alexandria was kind of a big deal. It was the 2nd largest city in the Roman Empire. It was a cultural, religious, philosophical, literary hub, both of sort of Greco-Roman culture and cultures from all over the then known world. People from China, from India, from what we would consider the Middle East, all over the Mediterranean, down into Ethiopia and other regions would come to Alexandria to trade both goods and ideas. It was a busy, busy city, and it had all the good things and the bad things that come with a major city. It's going to have lots of cultural inspirations, but it's also going to have lots of poverty. It's going to have lots of temptations, if you will. But I'm not necessarily just talking about what we might call standard moral temptations. I'm talking about temptations to success and wealth and pride. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The other thing, so most of the people, you have a lot of the monks would come from Alexandria. They would be Greek speaking, they would be often very literate, and they would leave an elite class lifestyle and journey into the wilderness and live there in isolation or in isolation together, sort of either in a proto-monastic sort of community or in a community where you'd have a neighbor about a mile away that you could go and visit if you needed to. But you also have monks coming from the Nile Valley, which you can follow that little strip of greenish brown land going down the center of Egypt. And if you notice, the green strip doesn't go very far out, right? That is the strip of cultivatable land within which most of the towns and cities of Egypt that weren't in the Nile Delta up in the north would have been. Everything else is wilderness. I actually think we call it desert. To me, desert makes me think of big rolling dunes of sand. This is more of a wilderness of rock and sand. There's still plenty of sand, don't worry. And so monks would go out and often form communities of isolation. Down in the south, where you see Pachomius, he was a real innovator in sort of the monastic life, where brothers, and then across the river, his sister formed a convent with women, would live a common life. But the people we're going to be talking about today are mainly living as hermits in communities that would be within reach of each other with a good few hours walk. And one in particular I want you to note, where the vast majority of these desert fathers and mothers are living, is a place called Scetis, up there towards the northwest. There's not going to be a quiz on this map. I just wanted to give you a little bit of orientation to where we are talking about. Now let's go to the fun one. This is a painting depicting Abba Anthony the Great. He looked just like that. Well, probably not. But Abba Anthony is considered the, quote, first desert monk, desert father. He's not at all the first, but he's the first to really gain a lot of fame and inspire folks to this life of isolation, of prayer, of fasting, of continence, etc. And you'll notice there that he's not having a good day. He's being torn apart, or at least torn at, by demons. You'll notice there are 8 of them, if I've counted right. Please, nobody tell me if I did not count right. These represent the 8 passions. The 8 passions will become, in a few centuries, what we know as the 7 deadly sins. Now, ignoring the fact of the question of how you get from 8 to 7 and all that, I want to focus on the difference between passions and sin, at least the way we typically talk about sin. For the desert fathers and mothers, the passion is not about discrete acts that we do that are wrong, that piss off God. It's more about conditions of the soul that we suffer. Notice, Anthony in that picture isn't doing anything wrong. He's the one who's suffering, right? And so the passions are sort of these disordered movements of the soul that lead us to do things that are bad, but they're caused by a condition we experience. We can think of it more as a medical understanding of sin, right? As a medical condition rather than a legal thing of you're guilty, it is your suffering. So the 8 passions, as they have it, are, and I'm going to get this without looking at my notes, anger, gluttony, lust, avarice. Okay, that's 4. Despondency, interestingly enough. I'm missing 1. And then there's pride and vainglory. I got 7, so that feels good. I'm going to come out of this share, and then I'm going to figure out which one I missed. Acedia, my favorite. Acedia is basically what becomes known as sloth, but it has nothing to do with what we think of as sloth. It's that sort of need for distraction and never being happy with doing what you're doing, or being where you are, or being with who you're with. Now, given more time, I would go deeply into these passions because, as you may have thought when I read them off, they can be problematic for us and for our understanding of healthy spiritual lives. And so when we read the Desert Fathers and Mothers, we cannot simply appropriate them wholesale. We have to take them and adapt them to our condition. For instance, gluttony can really be connected to some dangerous body image issues, some dangerous body shaming, and to unhealthy relationships with food. And yet there might be some spiritual discipline that we might glean from it as well. But We're not going to get into that because this is a very brief thing, and I want to get to the good stuff. So for the rest of our time, I simply want to offer a few sayings from the Desert Fathers and Mothers to give you a sense of what they were about. So this is how we basically know about the Desert Fathers and Mothers. People would write about their lives, but they would also collect sayings by them. And for my money, the sayings are the real meat. I find the lives a bit boring, but that's okay. So I want to begin with this. If you wish to be perfect, control your stomach and your tongue. Now, I'm not attributing that to a particular father or mother because it shows up all the darn time. It is a constant theme. And controlling your stomach and your tongue has to do not simply with food, it has to do with desire and anger. Desire and anger. So controlling your stomach might be specifically about, you know, develop a healthy relationship with food and the earth and environment, but it could also be, what do you take into yourself? What do you want to claim and devour in a good way or a bad way? And the tongue, this is where I feel very called out. Any statement that has to do with anger, I want to put the book down and say, well, that's just not fair. But here's the thing. They talk about anger a heck of a lot more than they talk about lust. They're concerned about lust, but lust as an obsession for them is not nearly as much as anger because they know how dangerous anger can be. Let's go hit up a few other sayings. A brother came to Abba Piman and said to him, Abba, that means father. Amma would be mother. It's a term of respect. I have many thoughts and am in danger from them. Thoughts being not good thoughts, temptations, etc. The elder took him out into the open air and said to him, inflate your chest and hold the winds. But he said, I cannot do that. The elder said to him, if you cannot do that, neither can you prevent the thoughts from coming. Your task is to withstand them. And I think this gives a good sense of what the Abbas and Ammas were up to. They weren't up to completely rid themselves of temptations. They were trying to learn how to deal with temptations. And if they don't know how to deal with temptation, how can they live in the city among so many people and so many temptations without falling into sin? You're still going to get the temptation. You're still going to get thoughts that are dangerous. That's okay. You can't get rid of them, but you can learn to withstand them. A brother came to Abba Macarius, the Egyptian, and said to him, Abba, give me a word that I might be saved. So the old man said to him, go to the cemetery and abuse the dead. The brother went there, abused them, and threw stones at them. Then he returned and told the old man about it. The latter said to him, didn't they say anything to you? He replied, no. The old man said, go back tomorrow and praise them. So the brother went away and praised them, calling them apostles, saints, and righteous men. He returned to the old man and said to him, I have complimented them. And the old man said to him, did they not answer you? The brother shook his head, no. Then Abba Macarius said to him, you know how you insulted them and they did not reply, and how you praised them and they did not speak? So you too, if you wish to be saved, must do the same and become a dead person. Like the dead, take no account of either the scorn of humans or their praises, and you can be saved. The thing the Desert Mothers and Fathers write about more than anger is pride and vainglory. These are two terms we often get confused. I know I did before preparing my class I'm teaching at the moment. Pride is thinking too highly of yourself. Vainglory is wanting others to think highly of you. This is the real danger for the monk. They even go on and say things about monks who have made so much progress in their fasting, in their celibacy, in their control of their tongue even. But if they think, look, I have done a good thing in doing these things, forgetting that it is only by God's grace, then they fall. And everything else they have done is worthless. I'd like to close with two sayings. Well, one's more of a story than a saying, that I think get to the heart of the goal of desert spirituality. Dorotheus of Gaza, so he would have been up in Palestine, depicts what he calls a wheel. Well, it is a wheel. I don't know why I'm saying that. He depicts a wheel, and he says, imagine that God is at the center of the wheel, and the spokes of the wheel are other people. We are on a journey from the outside of the rim to the center. We are on a journey to the center of the heart of God. But the key is, the closer we get to God, the closer we get to other people, and vice versa. So it's returning us to that understanding of love of God and love of neighbor. All the stuff about conquering the passions and of fasting and of continence and of learning how to not be angry and how to not have pride or vainglory isn't just to say, I want to be awesome. It is to say, I want to love God and neighbor properly. And finally, my absolute favorite saying that leads us to the idea that one of the reasons that they're doing these disciplines is that they know that in order to love God and neighbor, we need to receive and be filled with the love of God. And I don't mean the love of God, I don't mean the love of God in the sense of the love by which we love God. I mean the love by which God loves us. I mean the love that is the presence of God by which we love God and neighbor. And so, to conclude, Abba Lot went to Abba Joseph and said to him, Abba, as far as I can, I say my little prayers, I fast a bit, I pray and meditate, I live in peace as far as I can, I purify my thoughts. What else can I do? Then the old man stood up and stretched his hands towards heaven. His fingers became like 10 lamps of fire. And he said to him, if you will, you can become all flame. If you will, you can become all flame. What the desert mothers and fathers believed and lived out to the best of their abilities is that the presence of God in our lives as individuals and as a community has no limit. In this time where we find ourselves isolated against our will, we're not voluntarily doing this. And in a time where some people are experiencing it as difficult to do all their work, and others are experiencing it as difficult to not have their work anymore. At a time where some are worrying about childcare and others are worrying about dying or sick relatives. We have a chance, as is appropriate for each of us, we have a chance to think of what practices in our lives are essential for cultivating love of God and love of neighbor. Maybe nothing from the desert mothers and fathers will help us do that in particular. But at the very least, I think they call us to reflect on that question. And folks, I hate to tell you, but that's all I got.
Thank you, Adam. There are some questions and comments in the chat. I want to, you were making the move to now in some ways at the end here, and I kind of want to push a little bit on that in terms of you're seeing the resources of, for instance, these the reflection on these different passions.
Yeah.
To what people are experiencing, the sort of way we're talking about sheltering in place and social isolation now. I mean, I guess it's a different context, right? The desert
Sure.
mothers and fathers weren't in the midst of a plague or a pandemic. At least I don't think they were. They may have been at some time, but I don't think that was the case. So that level of danger or worry wasn't in the equation, I would guess.
Sure.
I don't know. I may be wrong about that. But do you have, I mean, do you have, like when you were talking about acedia,
yeah,
I couldn't help, I put in the chat, you know, it sounds like binge watching. You
sure.
know, the ways we are organizing ourselves and spending our time, and we all have this sense that something really could be achieved interpersonally and societally during this COVID time. And you hear kind of people swinging back between those poles, you know, like this is a time when we could really imagine a new economy. We could imagine new ways of organizing ourselves. We can imagine new ways of being church, right? You hear that, but then you also hear, oh, don't try to do too much.
Yeah.
So what do you think of that? I
Yeah.
mean, how does that relate to this tradition, and what do you, are there resources there to think about that a little bit?
Excellent. So this is one of the benefits of being in conversation with the desert mothers and fathers, is that they're completely inconsistent, right? Each figure has their own sort of charism, their own way of talking, their own way of approaching things, and their own sense of what discipline should look like. And so you have some that are really hardcore, and their disciples, they are, what's a word I'm looking for? They bear the brunt of that. You know, if you're so-and-so's disciple, you better be ready for it. There are others that are more gentle and kind of, well, okay, great. Like there's this great line from, I think it's Macarius, where someone's asking him how to pray. And he says, well, you should say this, and if you can't do that, you should just say, Lord God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And if the fight gets really bad, just stretch out your arms and say, Lord, help. And that is enough, right? And so what your question made me think of is those two poles. The answer is yes. I think part of learning to do spiritual discernment as an individual is learning that it looks different for different people. And it's a hard thing to do in the time of social media, because we are always aware of people that are doing more of whatever we think we should be doing, which might not be what we need.
We are awash in pride and vainglory.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And I am all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, that's great. Okay, Corla Masters has a question that she's sort of shortened here, so I'm going to give you the short version.
Okay.
And Corla's asking, did the desert, does anyone ever call them the desert parents? Desert
elders sometimes.
Oh, the desert elders. Okay. I mean, mothers and fathers. Okay.
They're parents, yeah.
Yeah, the desert parents. Did any of them understand themselves as, who did they understand themselves as serving by removing in themselves? Were they serving their urban neighbors? Were they serving God? I mean, what was the goal in their thinking? What's the goal of their service? What does their removal serve?
It's a good question and a difficult one to answer in our terms. And so that's partly a cop-out. But I think the best way I would like to answer that at the moment is that they had, among other things, a communal understanding of humanity and the sense of a common and shared nature. And so their growth towards perfection and love is by definition for them not individual. It is part of bringing humanity into the image of God. But
So it wasn't some self-perfection that they were involved in.
It definitely looks that way to us.
Right.
And by our terms, it definitely would be. Yeah. But I always depict it, and I'll continue to do it, even though it's not perfect, as, well, you separate in order to learn how to love, but it's not like they go back, right? So that's a bit of a lie. But I think for them, being able to love at a distance is better than being able to cheat and abuse up close.
I hear that. I mean, I love the idea that isolation is the space to work on your relationships.
Yeah.
And that when you were talking about the wheel, that really came through for me. Alan Bailey's asking, did the desert parents have influence on later traditions beside Christianity? So is there any cross-fertilization to Buddhism or something like that?
I have no idea. We know that people, some of the intellectuals in Alexandria would have known of and possibly met Buddhists. But as far as this particular cultural exchange, I do not know.
Wonderful. Kim Pearl is asking, did some of these folks flee to the desert to avoid persecution?
I'm trying to remember.
Religious or political persecution?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the details. The answer is at least sort of. And I'm trying to remember a lot of the details. They were, at least some of them, very involved in the political and theological conflicts of the time. And they would have had, some of them, relationships with certain bishops who would have come into and out of favor with certain emperors around issues of the Trinity and Christology. And you certainly have conflicts that arise where monks end up forming bands and go and beat people up. So that's not their finest hour. Especially my favorite is for a bishop who was accused of having another bishop beaten up, and his defense was he wasn't a bishop. So that's nice. But as far as why they went out there, I'm sure there were, but I don't like to say things without having the specific thing in mind. So I'm pretty sure the answer is yes.
Okay, great. So Sarah Durker is asking, well, Sarah's really compelled by this idea of the passions and the idea of sin as a medical condition.
Yeah.
And Sarah's asking, that's especially compelling because we're in a health crisis right now.
Yeah, right.
Thinking about that. What are some good resources that might be available to think about sin in this way? Are there theologians or branches of theology that develop this idea of sin as a sort of condition more than individual bad acts.
Well, Sarah is a good Methodist, so she should go straight to John Wesley.
There you go.
John Wesley, of course, has a very clear, he does sort of both the legal and the medical, but he tries to bring a lot more of the medical in. John Wesley on the Via Salutis and Sin and Salvation would be a great place to go. And I'd say Eastern Christianity does it more. It's there in Latin Christianity, and I'll fight any scholar who says otherwise, but it is more prominent in the Eastern Church. People like, I'm thinking Athanasius on the Incarnation, or Irenaeus on the Apostolic Preaching, things like that. And then I'm sure there are modern folks, but I don't read current events.
Okay, well, it's good to know your limits, or state them. Questions about resources with regard to desert elders' spirituality, particularly as it might connect to the pandemic. Is anyone other than you doing work in making this connection?
Probably. This is where the limits of my teaching go, right? I'm not a Desert Fathers and Mothers scholar, and so I don't live and move in that intellectual world as much. I like teaching them, but that's my limitations. I will say that if you're interested in accessible ways to get at the desert elders, the desert rents, in ways that particularly are apropos for our spiritual lives, there are a couple books by Roberta Bondi, B-O-N-D-I, and to pray and to love as God loves, which are very short, very accessible, and her name is now in the chat. There is a book that came out about a decade ago, I think, which is kind of the go-to introduction to desert monasticism by William Harmless. His last name spelled just like the descriptive adjective, called Desert Christianity. And it's thicker, it's got footnotes and all that, but it's really accessible and very engaging. Most of what I know about desert Christianity, I completely stole from him.
It is a wonderful name.
It is, isn't it? Sadly, Bill passed away very early, very young, about 5 years ago. Sad loss.
Wonderful. So in thinking about this tradition, and maybe John Copeland is asking, were the rents Orthodox for the most part? Any heretics among the rents?
Oh, it depends on who you're asking.
We're asking you.
Well, then they're all beautifully Orthodox. No, you definitely had divisions around, not so much around Trinitarian issues, but around Christological issues. Once those hit the fore, kind of in the early to mid 5th century, the monks really took sides. And the Coptic church in sort of southern Egypt, kind of outside of the major cities, went with non-Chalcedonian Christianity. And that created a major split. And of course, the monks followed, and those who didn't left. But the monks found themselves, most of them, in non-Orthodox Christological regions. Non-Orthodox from a Chalcedonian perspective, of course. As far as the Trinity, I'm sure there was some conflict, but not as much, I think.
Could I ask you to put that image of, is it Anthony?
Yeah.
Abba Anthony up on the, I wanted, before this session started and you had this image up and I was laughing about it because it looks like here he is having, as you said, his bad day. while it just looks like below on the regular plane, life is just going on as normal. There's a boat on the river, there's a field, there's a sense of sort of everyday life. And then
Yeah.
he's having this sort of spectacular experience, spectacularly horrible experience, but it's a almost on another plane, right?
Yeah.
And it has me thinking about where we are now in terms of states and cities opening up. You
Sure.
know, some of us remain sheltered while others are just going about their everyday lives. And I guess I wonder about the self-understanding of the desert rents around, like, did they think of themselves as sort of social freaks? Did they think of themselves as out of step? Or did others see them that way? I guess,
Yeah.
like, because I'm very aware when I'm wearing my mask, people look at me like I'm a freak. And I think that's crazy.
That's funny. That's how I look at people when they're not wearing a mask.
Right, but I mean, there's this sort of division, right?
Yeah.
So, I guess that just got me thinking about that.
Yeah, two thoughts. One, they didn't see themselves as freaks. They would have seen themselves as, to use some ableist language, the only sane ones in an insane world.
Mm-hmm.
And if you see the world going on below there, it looks like he's the unique one, or he's the one out of place, but it's the world going on as usual that is mired in sin.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas he, though beset by demons, is actually freer.
He's working on it.
Exactly. And so one thing that occurred to me when you first started talking about this, Deb, was that this isn't one guy and then the world. This is how every human relates to the world. We pass by business as usual, but every person is being torn to shreds by something.
Yeah. And just to put it all in perspective, Zippy just let us know from an art historical perspective that this is just the way painting is.
Oh, yeah, yeah. You have to have a boat.
Very common motif, so stop making so much out of it.
Hush, Zippy. We will overinterpret. It's our jobs.
Oh, that's great. Well, any last words or thoughts to share for the good of the order, Dr. Ployd?
From me, no. I will just say this is really fun. Feel free to email me if you would like some resources on this. This is something I'm still learning about, so I thank y'all for this opportunity to talk a little bit about it. Josh Brockway is in the audience, and I will just tell him to email me everything I got wrong, because he is an expert.
Oh, okay, good. Could you just say one word about your class this summer?
Online.
Oh, I mean, not maybe more.
Okay. I'm sorry. So basically, this online class is completely asynchronous, meaning that you do it at your own pace over the next month and a half. And it's all online. You'll have a couple of videos from me. You'll do some discussion threads. You'll take some quizzes, stuff like that. You'll basically read the two books by Roberta Bondi, and you will read all of the sayings of the Desert Fathers and Mothers, or the Desert Rents, as I will now call them, and engage them.
Great. All right. So if this interests you, is the class still no audit?
I don't know. I don't know what audit would look like on that sort of thing, because it's designed for students to go one thing to the next. So you really just have to do everything.
Yeah.
So you might as well get some credit for it.
In on, yeah, that kind of a project. Okay, great. Well, what a wonderful session. Thank you so much, Adam. We really thoroughly enjoyed it. And it's been a great way to cap off this set of lectures and conversations and presentations, and really just an assembling of this community and being in one another's company around the resources of our faith. And it's been encouraging and heartening, not only to see your faces, but to be engaged in thinking this way with you. So thank you so much. And we'll hope to, people are all thanking you, Adam.
I see. That's so kind. Thank you all.
It's just like a washing over you. It's love. There you go. All right. Well, thank you so much. And all the best and good night and God bless. See you soon.
Bye-bye.